The cold came through the car window before Hugh Vandermeer said a single word. Not the ordinary Ottawa in February cold that Delphine Harker had known her entire life. The kind that settled into your coat and stayed politely, almost respectably, but something sharper, something personal. She sat in the passenger seat of Hugh's campaign-issued Audi, still in the navy wrap dress she'd bought 3 weeks ago at a boutique on Elgin Street. The one she'd had altered twice, because she wanted the fabric to fall properly across her hips. The dress had cost more than she'd meant to spend. She'd felt beautiful in it, briefly, standing in the fitting room mirror with the seamstress marking the hem and saying, "Genuinely, you have a lovely shape." That had been enough to get her through the door of the St. Elias Ballroom tonight, where 240 donors had raised money for Hugh's federal campaign, where Hugh had stood at the podium and spoken about community and dignity, and the kind of Canada he believed in. He hadn't looked at her once the entire evening. "I need you to understand," Hugh said now, his voice smooth and measured in the way that made him good on television, "how badly tonight went." Delphine kept her eyes on the Rideau River as it passed on their left, dark and half-frozen, lit by the amber street lamps of Colonel By Drive. "I thought it went well. Pemberton wrote the largest check of the night. Pemberton's wife asked me if you were my sister." The words landed without inflection, which was somehow worse than if he'd shouted them, "My sister Delphine." Because she couldn't fathom that a man in my position would be there with, he exhaled through his nose, with someone who looks the way you look. She'd heard variations of this for 2 years. The way it worked was that she would go quiet, and he would take her silence as consent, and the next morning he would bring her coffee and speak normally, as if the cruelty had been weather, something that happened and then passed. She had understood for a long time that she stayed, because leaving felt like proof that he was right, that she was the liability he described. Tonight, something in her had already started to close off like a valve. "I don't think Pemberton's wife." "Do not," Hugh said. "Defend your own mediocrity to me." The car slowed. They were nowhere near his Centertown condo, nowhere near her apartment in the Glebe. They were on a stretch of industrial road near the Bayview Yards, February black on both sides, no foot traffic, no other headlights. Hugh put the car in park. "Get out." Delphine looked at him, the familiar handsome face, the jaw that photographed well, the grey threading his temples that his campaign manager said looked trustworthy, and felt for the first time no fear underneath the shock, only a strange, clarifying fury. "It's -18, Hugh. I know what the temperature is." He reached across her, unlatched the door, and shoved it open. The cold hit her like a wall. "You have your phone. Call a cab. I don't want you in this car." She should have moved faster. She should have grabbed her clutch and stepped out with whatever dignity remained. But she turned to look at him one more time, this man who had told her, in his early letters, that her mind was the most beautiful thing he'd ever encountered. This man who had spent the last 8 months systematically replacing that assessment with its opposite. And something in her face must have registered as defiance, because he put his hand flat on her shoulder and pushed. She hit the pavement on her palms and left knee. The cold asphalt tore through her stockings. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the creak of the river ice somewhere below the embankment, and then the slam of the car door and the acceleration of the Audi pulling away, tail lights shrinking red in the dark. Delphine knelt on the road for perhaps 15 seconds, long enough to feel the cold working through the thin fabric of her dress with brutal efficiency, long enough to hear Hugh's voice looping in her memory, mediocrity, liability, someone who looks the way you look, and to decide very quietly that she would not die on a road in Bayview, with his words being the last ones that mattered. She was trying to stand, one palm flat on the pavement, when the headlights appeared. Not one set. 3. A convoy of black navigators moving in tight formation, slowing as they approached. She couldn't get her knee under her properly. The torn stocking was freezing to the abrasion, and the cold had started doing something strange to her hands. She looked up into the headlights and could not see past them. A door opened, footsteps, several, quick and purposeful. "Don't touch her yet." The voice came from somewhere behind the lights, quiet, accented faintly with the cadence of someone who'd grown up speaking both French and English, and had never bothered to flatten either. "Give her a moment." "She's going to freeze, Corbin." I said give her a moment. One of the navigators edged forward so its headlights tilted away from her face, and she could see them. 4 men in dark coats, and standing slightly apart, a man who looked nothing like anyone who should be on this road at this hour. Tall, dark coat, a face that managed to be both still and watchful in a way that reminded Delphine of the space between a question and its answer. He crouched down in front of her, eye level. She noticed that he didn't glance at her torn stockings or the mess the pavement had made of her dress, the way people sometimes did when they were deciding whether a situation was worth their time. He looked at her face. "Can you stand?" he asked. "I was about to," Delphine said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. He offered his hand, open, unhurried, and she took it, and he brought her to her feet with the uncomplicated ease of someone who was simply helping a person up, nothing more and nothing less. "Corbin Auger," he said. She knew the name. Anyone who'd spent 2 years in Ottawa political circles knew the name, the way you knew the names of forces of nature, not because you understood them, but because you understood they existed. Corbin Auger ran the operations that funded half of Eastern Canada's grey economy. He was, depending on who you asked, a philanthropist, a money launderer, a ghost, or the most important man in a room who never appeared on the guest list. "Delphine Harker," she said. Her teeth were beginning to chatter. He took off his coat without drama and settled it over her shoulders. It was absurdly warm. It smelled like cedar and cold air, and something underneath both that she couldn't name. "My car," he said simply, and she let herself be walked to the lead navigator because the alternative was hypothermia, and she was not going to let Hugh Vandermeer's discard be the last decision she ever made. She woke in a room that was not a hospital, but had been arranged with the same functional seriousness. Clean white walls, an IV stand, a window that looked out over the frozen Ottawa River toward Gatineau. A man with a medical bag and the tired eyes of someone who had been called at odd hours for years told her she had a cracked kneecap, moderate hypothermia, and bruised palms, and that she was to stay horizontal until further notice. "How long?" she asked. "At least until tomorrow, possibly 3 days. I have to go to work." "Mademoiselle Harker," the man said, not unkindly, "you were found on a road in February without a coat. Work can wait." She slept, woke, slept again. The second time she woke, Corbin Auger was in the room, sitting in the chair near the window with a folder open across his knee, reading in the way that suggested he did it efficiently and without sentiment. He looked up when she stirred. "There's water on the table," he said. "You know who I am," she said. It wasn't a question. "I knew within 20 minutes of putting you in the car." He closed the folder. "You're a CPA. You've been with Vandermeer's campaign as a financial volunteer since last April. Before that, 2.5 years as his partner." A pause. He filed a missing persons report 40 minutes ago. Something cold moved through Delphine's chest that had nothing to do with the previous night's temperature. "He knows I'm not missing. He knows exactly where he left you." Corbin set the folder on the windowsill and leaned forward, forearms on his knees. "The question is why he'd want a record establishing that you disappeared." She looked at him for a long moment. This man who should have driven past her. This man who, by every rational calculation, had no reason to be sitting in this chair at this hour. "What do you want?" she asked. "An honest conversation." He said it the way people said things they meant. "Hugh Vandermeer has been taking money from a network I've been at war with for 4 years, Eastern European, running cash through campaign donations and real estate holding companies since 2021. Hugh's been laundering it clean through his campaign finance structures. The federal authorities know something's wrong, but they can't find the mechanism. He paused. I want him shut down. I want the network exposed. And I think you are the only person in a position to help me do that. I'm a volunteer. He never let me near the actual accounts. No, Corbin said, but you lived with that man for 2 years. You know how he operates, his habits, his paranoia, the places he thinks are safe. His eyes were the color of the river ice outside, grey-green, very clear. He used your credentials, Delphine. 3 times last year, he had documents signed under your professional license without your knowledge. If this goes wrong for him, you're the name on the paper. The information arrived in her body before it arrived in her mind. She felt it as a physical sensation, a dropping, a sudden rearrangement of all the weight she'd been carrying. He hadn't just been cruel. He had been building a net with her name woven through it. How do you know this? She asked quietly. Because I've been watching him for 18 months, and you've been in the frame of the picture without knowing it. Something moved across Corbin's face, not pity, something more like acknowledgement. I'm sorry it took me this long to see what he was doing to you personally. That part I failed to notice. Delphine looked down at her bandaged palms. She thought about the dress she'd altered twice. She thought about every dinner party where she'd monitored her own portions, because Hugh's eyes tracked her plate. She thought about the seamstress who had said you have a lovely shape, and how she'd held that sentence like a secret for weeks. What are you proposing? She asked. Partnership. You stay here, safe, while you recover. We identify the documentation he's hiding, and we build the case. In exchange, Corbin sat back. In exchange, I remove your name from every document he compromised, and I give you front-row access to watching everything he built collapse. Delphine looked at the window, the river, the grey sky above Gatineau. All right, she said, tell me where he keeps the physical records. Over the next 2 weeks, she rebuilt herself around the work. Corbin's operation ran from a property in Old Ottawa South that looked, from the outside, like a restored Edwardian house belonging to someone with good taste and mild eccentricity. Inside, it was a different matter. Secure servers, a team of forensic analysts, a war room with a whiteboard that covered an entire wall. Delphine sat at that whiteboard for hours, mapping what she knew. Hugh was meticulous in exactly the way frightened people are meticulous. Not because he was careful by nature, but because he'd built a system designed to be someone else's problem if it failed. He kept physical copies of every transaction that could incriminate him in a private archive. And that archive wasn't at the campaign office or the condo. It was at a document storage facility in Kanata, in a unit registered under Delphine's name, using her business number, signed over on a form she now remembered vaguely as routine tax paperwork from the accountant. He had me sign it at the Rogers Center fundraiser, she said. I was distracted. He had a pen out. I didn't read it. Pascal, Corbin's lead analyst, a quietly intense man who expressed emotion exclusively through the speed at which he typed, looked up from his screen. The unit contains what we think. Everything he wouldn't digitize, the network's contact ledgers, the donation routing documentation, the offshore transfer confirmations. She paused, and whatever else he thought he needed to hide. Corbin was standing at the window. He turned. Can you access the unit? I'm the registered holder. The bitterness of this was not lost on her. He made sure of that. The Kanata storage facility was beige and fluorescent lit, and smelled of cold concrete and other people's archived lives. Delphine walked in wearing a charcoal wool coat that had been delivered to her 2 days prior, well cut, falling cleanly to her mid-thigh, the kind of garment that communicated competence without apology. 2 of Corbin's people flanked her in civilian clothes. Pascal was in the car outside, monitoring the facility's management software. The unit manager checked her ID against the registration and handed her the key without question. She found the archive boxes in the back half of Unit 34, stacked on industrial shelving. She worked quickly, opening the first box, confirming the ledger format, transferring the relevant documents into the courier bag she'd brought. The offshore routing files, the donation restructuring records, the network correspondence, which used a shorthand she recognized from campaign documents she'd seen Hugh review. She'd assumed at the time it was supplier notation. It was the fourth box that stopped her. Inside, beneath a layer of campaign brochures from the 2022 by-election, was a manila envelope with no label. She opened it because she had opened everything else. The first document was a life insurance policy issued through an offshore underwriting firm in the Cayman Islands. The insured party was Delphine Harker. The coverage amount was $11 million. The policy had been active for 4 months. The primary beneficiary, 75%, was Hugh Vandermeer. The secondary beneficiary, 25%, was a woman named Mireille Cosette. Clipped to the back of the policy were photographs. Hugh and a slender woman at a restaurant in Westmount. Hugh and the same woman on a dock somewhere, summer, a motorboat behind them. The timestamps on the photographs began 14 months ago, 4 months before the insurance policy, 11 months before the night on the Bayview Road. Delphine stood in the storage unit for a very long time. She thought about the route Hugh had taken that night, the route that added 22 minutes to the drive and passed no traffic cameras she could recall. She thought about the particular stretch of road he had chosen. No foot traffic, significant distance from any hospital, the river embankment close enough in the dark that someone on foot might not see the edge. He hadn't pushed her out of the car in a fit of rage. He had selected the location. She put the envelope in the bag, zipped it closed, and walked out of the unit with the same measured pace she'd walked in. She did not let herself feel it until she was in the Navigator with the door shut, and the heat running and Pascal looking at her from the front seat with an expression that said he could see something had happened. "Drive," she said, "please." She set the documents on Corbin's desk without speaking. She watched him read the insurance policy. She watched his jaw tighten as he reached the beneficiary page and continued through to the photographs. When he set the envelope down, he was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at her with the directness she'd come to expect from him. No management, no construction. "He tried to kill you," Corbin said. "He had a plan in place," Delphine said. "Whether that night was the intended execution of it or simply an opportunistic attempt, I don't know. But it wasn't just losing his temper." Corbin came around the desk. He stopped in front of her, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He put both hands gently on her shoulders, not holding her in place, not steering, just present in the way that told her he was choosing to be. "I should have moved faster," he said. "When I first identified you in the pattern, I should have moved faster. You couldn't have known. I knew what kind of man he was. I should have extrapolated." His hands dropped. He stepped back. "He priced your life at $11 million, Delphine. He will find out what it actually cost him." She looked at this man who dealt in darkness as a matter of professional necessity, who had pulled over on a February road because she was there and in danger, who had listened to her for 2 weeks without once treating her intelligence as an inconvenience. She felt something settle in her chest that was not certainty, exactly, but the quiet absence of the thing that had been contracting there for years. "Hugh's campaign victory party is in 4 days," she said. "He's leading in the polls by 11 points. Every donor, every party official, every journalist covering the Eastern Ontario race will be there." She paused. "I'd like to attend." Corbin held her gaze for a moment. "Then we'll need to make sure you're dressed appropriately." The National Arts Centre's 4th-floor reception hall was a wall of glass and winter light, the Ottawa River running grey-green below it in the early dark. By 8 o'clock the room was full. Campaign staff in their best, donors whose names appeared on federal disclosure lists, 2 cabinet ministers, 4 journalists from the National Press Gallery, and Hugh Vandermeer at the center of it all, working the room with the practiced ease of a man who believed the future was already resolved in his favor. He was accepting congratulations from the party whip when the elevator doors opened. Delphine stepped into the room. She was wearing a gown the color of dark burgundy, deep red, almost black in certain lights, the fabric a structured crepe that her stylist had paired with a single strand of dark pearls. The dress had been made for her in 4 days by a Montreal atelier. It fit her the way good clothes are supposed to fit, working with the body rather than managing it. She did not enter quietly. She had not come to be quiet. Corbin was half a step behind her. His people were already positioned throughout the room, indistinguishable from the other guests. The room noticed her before Hugh did. She saw heads turn, saw the ripple of recognition moving toward him, and watched the exact moment it arrived. The party whip's expression shifted. Hugh followed the man's gaze, and the color left his face as completely and rapidly as if a drain had been pulled. The ambient noise dropped, not to silence. Rooms like this rarely go fully silent, but to something reduced and attentive. Delphine. Hugh said her name the way you say a word when you're not certain it's real. What are you? I filed. We thought you were missing. I know what you filed. She walked toward him through the space the crowd was giving her, heels measured on the hardwood. I was in Bayview, on the road where you left me, she said it clearly, for the room. On February the 9th, at 23 minutes past 10, you stopped the car and pushed me out into -18-degree weather on a road with no foot traffic, no surveillance cameras, and significant distance from any hospital. She's not well, Hugh said loudly, addressing the room rather than her. She's been struggling, and she's clearly. I have the archive you stored in Unit 34 of the Kanata self-storage facility, Delphine said. Registered in my name, using my CPA license number, containing the complete financial documentation of your arrangement with the network you've been laundering money through for the past 3 years. She had reached him now. They were 2 meters apart. I also have the life insurance policies you took out on my life in October. $11 million, payable upon my accidental death. She looked at him steadily. Mireille Cossette says hello. The sound that moved through the room was not a gasp. It was something more complicated, the collective intake of people recalibrating everything they thought they understood about the evening. Hugh moved. He closed the distance between them fast, his hand reaching for her arm, his face doing the thing it did when the television polish cracked. Jaw too tight, eyes too small. He didn't reach her. Corbin stepped between them with the unhurried certainty of a man who had anticipated this specific moment. His hand closed over Hugh's wrist. The grip was not violent. It was simply conclusive. Don't, Corbin said. One word, the room heard it. Hugh looked at the man holding his wrist and understood, in the way you understand certain things all at once, the full dimension of what he was looking at. The money he'd been laundering, the people he'd been adjacent to without truly knowing it. His face went from red to the particular gray of someone realizing the walls have already closed. Let him go, Delphine said. Corbin released Hugh's wrist and stepped back beside her. I didn't come here to have him hurt, she said, looking at Hugh directly. I came here because 240 of your donors are in this room, and 6 federal journalists, and your party's whip, and I want every one of them to be present when you understand that you did not successfully get rid of me. She kept her voice even. You spent 2 years telling me I take up too much space. You were right. I do. I take up exactly this much space, and I'm not going to apologize for it. She turned to address the room, the journalists with their phones already raised, the donors exchanging glances with the particular discomfort of people recalculating financial allegiances. Copies of all documentation have been submitted to the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit and the Elections Canada Compliance Office as of 45 minutes ago. She paused. Enjoy the rest of your evening. She walked back through the room. The crowd moved for her, parted with the reflexive courtesy of people who understood, belatedly, that the balance of power in the room had shifted irrevocably. Corbin fell into step beside her. Behind them, she could hear the party whip saying Hugh's name in a tone that contained no warmth whatsoever. At the elevator, Pascal materialized. RCMP just confirmed receipt. They're sending a unit to the campaign office tonight. The elevator arrived. She stepped in. The network, she said. They'll know by midnight that their documentation is in federal hands. Yes, Corbin said, and they'll draw their own conclusions about who's responsible for that. Delphine thought about Hugh in that room. Between the journalists and the party machinery and the people who had just watched $11 million worth of motive walk out through the elevator doors on its own 2 feet, she thought about the form she'd signed at the Rogers Center fundraiser without reading it. She thought about Unit 34 and the seamstress on Elgin Street who had said you have a lovely shape as if it were simply an observable fact requiring no qualification. It was simply a fact. The elevator doors closed. Below them, through the glass lobby wall, the Ottawa River ran on in the dark, indifferent and continuous, carrying the winter south toward wherever rivers carry the things we stop holding on to. Delphine Harker had been left on a road in February by a man who had decided she was worth more dead than present. She had walked into his victory party and made certain he would never hold office, never access the accounts he'd built on her name, never again stand in a room and decide for someone else how much space they were permitted to occupy. She had not needed to become someone else to do it. She had only needed to stop apologizing for being exactly who she was. That, it turned out, had been more than enough all along.